Salvete, and welcome back to Weekly Roman History, where we separate Roman history into parts with checks and balances and strict term limits. If you're cramming and you've watched this whole series back to back, maybe take a break, okay? I care about your health. This week, we're going to properly start the Republic. In the last two videos, we ended the monarchy and described the complex system of government that the Republic used, though probably not as early as Roman historians say. My next few videos will not be quite chronological, because there are a lot of threads to follow in the Republic. In this video, I will focus on the social and political life of the early Republic, and I will tell you about its military history in the next one. My main sources are the secondary source histories by Mackay and Boatwright introduced in the last video, with some color commentary from Livy. We are in a murky area between legend and historical fact. For right now, assume that anytime I'm talking about specific people with names, the stories are legendary. The content warning for this video is rape. In this case, it is only threatened, not carried out. I'll use the title when it comes up. The early history of the Republic was marked by a lengthy class conflict, which is usually called the conflict or struggle of the orders. Officially, there are two orders at the outset of the Republic, the patricians and the plebeians. Patricians are the families who were in the Senate at the time of Tarquin's expulsion. Recall that senators were often called patres, which means fathers. That's the root word of patrician, which itself is the root of the name patricia. Plebeians are everybody else. The words plebeian and pleb are still used today to refer to the rabble of ordinary folks, usually with a negative connotation. Don't think of the word plebeian as negative in our context, because plebeians made up most of Rome. Only a tiny sliver of families were represented in the Senate, so the plebeians would have been something like 90% of the population. But the Senate claimed credit for having rid Rome of Tarquin, and thus reserved the right to hold offices for only themselves and their descendants. Thus, Rome is an oligarchy, ruled by a select few. According to Livy, trouble springs up between plebeians and patricians almost as soon as Rome has rid itself of the kings. The list of the plebeians' demands is consistent throughout the eras in Livy's accounts, which probably means it reflects the political climate of the eras just before Livy. But here's what the conflict seems to have been about. Plebeian access to high office. Plebeians were not content with having the upper class make all the decisions with no input from them, and I don't blame them. The right to appeal. An early Roman consul could be judge, jury, and executioner. He could make up charges and have fellow citizens executed unjustly. There was nothing to stop him from executing a plebeian because of a political dispute, a desire to seize their possessions, or just because he didn't like them. Plebeians demanded the right to appeal, that there would be someone else who could mediate between them and the patrician, and make sure the law was being followed, rather than one man having the right to punish them at will. Debt. Early Roman law allowed debt bondage, which was called nexum in Latin. Let's say you're a small-time farmer, and you've been getting by just fine, but one year a drought knocks out your entire crop. You have to feed your family somehow, so you go to a rich patrician who has years' worth of grain stored up from past harvests, an extravagance you could never have afforded because you only have a little bit of land to grow on. He loans you grain to get by. Problem is, you'll never make enough to pay him back in full with the amount of land you have, so you have to make payments to him every year from what you grow. If another bad year happens and you miss a payment, you are now in default, and he has the legal right to take ownership of you as a slave. You will continue to work your piece of land, but now that land belongs to your rich master, and so does the food you grow. You are his property now. That's debt bondage. It seems to have been a pervasive strategy in the early Republic era, both in Rome and in other regions. The rich knew the poor couldn't repay their debts, and that was the point. Once the lower class is enslaved, decades of free labor is way more lucrative than repayment with interest could ever be. So many plebeian efforts centered around eliminating people's debts and outlawing predatory lending. Debt bondage was eventually outlawed in Rome, though the reason is likely more sinister than successful lobbying by plebeians. As Rome's foreign wars became constant, the army consistently brought home foreigners enslaved from conquered people. It became much more economical to simply buy the slaves brought back from foreign conquest. Land reform. Patricians started out with an advantage over plebeians in land ownership because they were richer. Over a few generations of debt bondage, patricians exaggerated this advantage. By gradually acquiring small plebeian farms through nexum, patricians amalgamated all the land around Rome into massive patrician estates. Plebeians fought to limit the amount of land any one individual could own. By breaking up giant patrician plantations, they would free up land for plebeians who managed to gain enough wealth to buy land. At a more extreme end, many politicians are said to have worked to give away free land to the poor. Food. This is perhaps the most obvious one. As Rome's population exploded and the city urbanized, the majority of Romans weren't farmers and herders anymore, and it's a difficult task to bring enough grain into the city to feed everyone who lives there, which means food got really expensive. So plebeians tended to ask for grain at reduced prices, or for free, from the Roman state. Food distribution became a major occupation of government, and a constant flashpoint for controversy. So there's the list of the plebeians' demands. Different ones pop up with different emphases throughout history, but their substance remains relevant because the root causes are never addressed. At first, patricians have no real incentive to listen to what the plebeians want. Plebeians do vote for consul, but patricians' votes count for more because of the systems I described in the last video, and all the candidates are patrician anyway. So the Roman system is not nearly as responsive to voters' demands as modern systems are, and we all know that even modern systems aren't nearly as responsive as our ideals say they should be. What seems to have happened, and this is historical conjecture because it isn't how it's described in our unreliable literary texts, is that plebeians form what we would recognize today as a union. They create an informal assembly, later formalized as the plebeian assembly, and elect their own leaders, called tribunes. None of this is part of the government, so it winds up functioning effectively as a parallel second state. The patricians call the official assemblies and elect consuls and quaestors and such, and the plebeians meet informally to elect their tribunes, who will protect them from the consuls and quaestors and such. If a consul does something unfair to a citizen, that citizen can appeal to a tribune, who will intercede on their behalf with the consul. Union tactics would apply here. The tribune would come to the consul as a private citizen and negotiate on his fellow citizens' behalf. If the consul and the tribune can reach an agreement, all is well, and the tribune has fulfilled his duty protecting the rights of the citizenry. But if the consul refuses to budge, the tribune will then call on the plebeians for collective action, which is the real strength of the tribune. The two tools that the plebeians can use to make life bad for the oligarchy are riots and strikes. Remember that the plebeians make up the vast majority of the population. The common people creating violence in the streets or refusing to do any of the essential work needed to keep the city functioning can grind Rome to a halt. Probably they very seldom had to actually do these things, because once the tribunes had proved that they could make it happen, the patrician magistrates would have been highly motivated to negotiate. So that's probably the original role of the tribunes, unofficial rabble-rousers who could use disorderly conduct to protect plebeians' rights. When people are not given a voice in politics, they find a way. The next phase probably comes when the ruling patricians try to outlaw the tribunes in the plebeian assembly. The plebeians, to safeguard their rights, stage the biggest collective action yet. They leave the city entirely and settle on the Sacred Mount in 494 BCE. It's called the First Secession. Secession as in leaving, and first because there will be more. The plebeians time their secession to coincide with a war that is happening between Rome and 3 Italian tribes. By not showing up for the consul's draft, the plebeians put the safety of Rome in danger, forcing the patricians to negotiate. The consuls then accept the plebeian assembly and the tribunes of the plebs as official legal offices. What probably began as unofficial union tactics is now enshrined in Roman law. Now, in Livy, the story is a little different. In Livy, as in other Roman histories, the tribunate and the plebeian assembly are created for the first time as a result of the First Secession, which the plebeians stage when they get fed up. Also in Livy is a fanciful story in which an august representative of the patricians, named Menenius Agrippa, comes to the plebeians in their camp and tells them a parable. There was once a body, says Agrippa. The parts of the body were disgruntled. They all did their jobs to keep the body alive, but all the food went to the stomach. That greedy stomach, they said, someone needs to teach him a lesson. So they made a pact. From now on, the arms and hands wouldn't grab the food, the mouth wouldn't chew and swallow it, and they would starve that no-good stomach. And of course, the whole body died. What the other body parts didn't realize was that the stomach was a necessary part of the body, and it wasn't greedily eating all the food, but doing its job to make sure they could all live. And this parable is what convinces the plebeians to come back. Now, I don't know about you, but it strikes me as a silly and transparently self-serving metaphor, as if concentrating all the wealth and power in one group of people is comparable to a stomach, which takes in food and distributes nutrients, rather than just, keeping them. But whether or not you think an aristocracy is as vital to a society as a stomach is to a body, I think we can all agree that the patricians giving the plebeians what they were asking for was definitely a bigger reason for them to end their strike than a parable. When tribunes are made official, they are given the power of veto. Veto, Latin for I forbid. If any magistrate is taking an action that, in the tribune's judgment, will infringe on the rights of his people, the tribune can say, I forbid, and the action cannot be legally taken. This works in court, in the passage of laws, anywhere in the city that a magistrate has power, but only inside the city of Rome. Tribunes also have the power to convoke the plebeian assembly, which is given power to pass laws that affect only plebeians. Later in Roman history, the people successfully fight to expand this power, and the plebeian assembly is able to pass any kind of laws. It's actually harder to block laws passed through the plebeian assembly, so the tribunes of the plebs end up becoming the primary law writers of the late Republic. But that's not for a while yet. Because the tribune's original role is to intervene between a powerful magistrate and a powerless citizen, they are granted an additional protection. They are sacrosanct. Sacrosanct means that it is a sin against the gods to harm them in any way. Anyone who tries to hurt or kill them, even a consul, can be immediately executed without trial. That might seem extreme, but when you consider that the original consuls were probably not duly elected magistrates but warlords whose power consisted of personal armies ready to do their bidding, it's actually a pretty reasonable protection. Once tribunes are formalized, they are able to expand their role from merely interceding on behalf of individuals to working for the good of all plebeians. Now the tribunes are engaging in political fights over things like debt reform, land reform, the food supply. Plebeians' demands have to be taken seriously now, because a tribune's veto can make a real difference. Patricians try to avoid granting more to the plebeians and hang on to their absolute power. Whenever the people start getting too organized, there always seems to be a war that needs fighting, which means the consuls need to draft plebeians and lead them onto the battlefield. Whether it's on purpose or not, this has a way of constantly resetting the debate so that little progress is made. But the plebeians have a countermeasure. When they are determined enough not to let the patricians change the subject, they don't show up for drafts. During this time, a young patrician named Gaius Marcius gains military glory in a war against the Volsci, an Italian tribe, by capturing the city of Corioli. He earns an agnomen and becomes Gaius Marcius Coriolanus after the city he took. In 491 BCE, 3 years after the First Secession, there's a big famine in Italy. Sicily has not been struck, so Rome imports a bunch of Sicilian grain. It's the consensus of the Senate that this should be sold to the starving poor at a drastically reduced price. Coriolanus leads a group of noblemen who argue that before the Senate relieves the suffering of the poor, they should first force them to agree to give up the plebeian assembly and the tribunes of the plebs that they gained 3 years earlier. He doesn't convince them. The Senate does the right thing and feeds the people, and the story of his plan gets out. Coriolanus goes from hero to villain in the eyes of the plebeians, and he is exiled after he refuses to show up at a trial put on by the tribunes of the plebs. Coriolanus goes to live among the Volsci, who are the same people he defeated 2 years before. He's mad at the Senate and people who turned their backs on him, so he goes full traitor and offers to help the Volsci shake off Roman dominance. As commander of the Volscian army, he captures a bunch of cities from Rome, including a second capture of Corioli and an invasion of Lavinium. After a series of successes, he plans for the big one, the march on Rome itself. He camps near the city and starts to raid the countryside, directing the Volsci to target plebeian land and spare patricians. The Roman Senate sends Coriolanus' mother, Veturia, his wife, Volumnia, and his young sons to see him in his camp, where they plead with him not to attack his own people. Coriolanus relents and gives up the war around 488 BCE. Although his story is likely only a legend, it shows the kind of high stakes in the conflict of the orders. Coriolanus' class consciousness turns him from war hero to exile, and his wounded pride turns him into an enemy of the state. There's actually a Shakespeare play about Coriolanus. It's not one of the more famous ones because it's not very well liked. The next fight in the conflict of the orders is restricting the powers of the consuls and other office holders. The consuls have assumed all the powers of the old kings, which means they're basically free to do what they want if no one stops them. The plebeians, represented by the tribunes, want laws codified and written down. Written laws are a form of protection of individual rights. No laws to refer to means unlimited power in the hands of the powerful. The patricians fight it for a while, but eventually relent so long as it's the patricians who do the writing. According to ancient historians, they first send a delegation of 3 senators to Athens to study the Athenian law code, which was written by Solon and seen as the greatest legal achievement in the ancient world so far. That's unlikely to be true, as there wasn't yet much direct contact between the Greek and Roman worlds. But the fabled delegation comes back in 452 BCE, and it is decided that instead of electing consuls for 451 BCE, the Senate will appoint the decemviri. The decemviri, as their name suggests if you know enough Latin, are a 10-man panel. The Senate decides that they couldn't have one set of officers enforcing laws at the same time another set are writing new ones, so the decemviri are given power over the city without the right of appeal to tribunes. The men chosen for the decemviri are the senators who traveled to Greece, some former consuls, and more generally well-connected patricians. They rule for their year justly, managing the city's affairs while drafting laws. They bring out the laws for public feedback frequently and make amendments. When their year is over, they have 10 tablets of law, but they tell the Roman people that their work is not done. so it is decided to elect a second set of decemviri for 450 BCE. Prominent among the first set of decemviri was Appius Claudius. There are actually a lot of people named Appius Claudius in Roman history. The Claudian clan was really powerful, and they had a tradition of naming every firstborn son Appius, a Sabine name that only the Claudii used. So don't be confused when I bring up more Appii Claudii later. They won't be the same guy. Anyway, before his tenure in the decemviri, Appius Claudius was known as a prideful patrician who hated plebeians. That's actually the reputation of the entire Claudian clan. They're known as arrogant aristocrats. But during his time as one of the first decemviri, Claudius makes himself the friend of the common man. He argues for their causes among his colleagues and shows the plebeians favor in legal matters. It looks like a total 180, but it's actually a ruse. When the time comes to elect the second set of decemviri, most of the first set believe that it should be 10 different men to avoid the possibility of any of them seizing tyrannical power. But Appius Claudius campaigns to be re-elected, and even more unethically gets himself appointed to run the election. The other decemviri don't like it, but the people support Claudius now. So because of the risk of rioting, they feel they have to go along with it. Claudius rigs the election, and the second set of decemviri is composed of Claudius and 9 young noblemen who don't yet have much distinction. Because Claudius is the only experienced politician of the bunch, he easily bends the others to his will. Together they seize absolute power, showing up with 12 lictors each, all with the axes in their fasces. They start to act cruelly toward the plebeians. The plebeians try to appeal to the Senate, but though the Senate doesn't like what the new decemviri are doing, they are aligned politically. The Senate is more afraid of the plebeians seizing power than they are of a group of patrician tyrants, so they let the decemviri do what they want. The second decemviri write 2 more tablets of law, and when their year is up, they refuse to allow elections or yield power. Appius Claudius plans to rule Rome indefinitely as the head of his 10-man panel of tyrants. According to the legends, this all comes to a head in a very similar way as Tarquin's tyranny, because of impropriety toward a woman. The story that follows is similar to that of Lucretia, and in some ways it's worse. I'm putting up a content warning for rape, though it's hard to know how to classify the sensitive nature of this story. Misogyny might be a better warning. So, Appius Claudius lusts after Verginia. Notice the E in that name, it's not the same as the state. Verginia is the daughter of a plebeian centurion who is away from the city with the army. She refuses his advances. She is an honorable young woman engaged to be married. So Claudius conspires with a friend, who declares in court that Verginia is not a freeborn woman, but actually his slave. There's no evidence for this, but Claudius is presiding over the court, and he rules in favor of his friend. As soon as Verginia is his slave, his friend can hand her over to Claudius. In the struggle that ensues, Verginius, the father of Verginia, who rushed back to Rome from the army, kills his daughter rather than allow her to fall into Claudius's hands. According to Verginius, her virtue is more important than her life. Which is, problems. The parallel with Lucretia taking her own life because of her chastity being violated is obvious, but this is even worse because it's her father making that decision for her. All of this is heavily symbolic. In this and many other legendary instances, women's chastity stands in for the safety and sanctity of the Roman state, and tyrants cannot help but try to violate both. But because this is a murder instead of a suicide, and the father is killing his daughter rather than telling her she's done nothing wrong, the story does not work for a modern audience at all. So remember that Verginia is more symbol than person, which is its own problematic dehumanizing thing to say about a woman. Verginius flees back to his military camp, a grieving father, and tells his story to his fellow troops. The army then throws off its patrician commanders and goes to besiege Rome to demand the removal of the decemviri. The rest of the plebeians leave the city to join them, which is the Second Secession. The Senate, brought around to the people's side, convinces the decemviri to resign. Once there are consuls and tribunes of the plebs again, the tribunes start to put the decemviri on trial. Appius Claudius dies in prison before the conclusion of his trial, and the rest either suffer the same fate or run away into self-imposed exile before they can be brought to trial. So after almost lapsing into lawless tyranny, Rome resumes in 449 BCE as a republic operating under the laws known as the 12 Tables, the 10 tablets written by the first decemviri and the 2 written by the second. The 12 tables are inscribed in bronze and displayed in the forum so that anyone can know the legalities of what crimes they might be charged with. It is tempting to view the 12 tables as the Roman Constitution, and certainly they occupy a similar space in the Roman imagination as the US Constitution does in that of Americans. But there's an important difference. Modern constitutions are framework documents. They don't contain specific laws, but processes by which laws are created, enforced, and amended. The 12 tables do not survive in full, but the fragments we do have show them to be a law code, not a framework. They deal in specifics, specific monetary amounts as punishments for specific crimes. The decemviri and the 12 tables are the last major events of the conflict of the orders in the 5th century BCE. I'll pick the thread of the plebeians and patricians back up soon, but in the next video, I'm going to talk about what was going on outside the city walls at this time. At the same time the patricians are fighting the plebeians tooth and nail to protect their dominance over the city, they're also using the plebeians as foot soldiers in a continuous cycle of warfare that results in the Roman conquest of Italy. Strap on your collar guy, because next week we are marching into military history.